Welcome to the first video on Chapter 2, The Planting of the English Americas, from the American Pageant textbook. The focus of this chapter is going to be on the colonization of the southern colonies of America and the beginning of Britain's colonization. So, to start off, Britain had neglected to colonize during the 1500s because of a couple internal conflicts. First off, King Henry VIII launched the Protestant Reformation, so there was a lot of internal squabbles going on. And then when Elizabeth I became queen, Britain became entirely Protestant. And the reason that this is an issue is the two main powers in the world at this time were Spain and Britain. And Spain was all Catholic. And Protestants and Catholics didn't get along. So there was a lot of tension and divide between Spain and Britain after this occurred. And so then the Catholics in Ireland revolted against the Protestants in England, and the uprising was crushed, even though they tried to get help from Spain, who was also Catholic, but they didn't get much help. And this sort of developed an attitude of sneering contempt for natives from England. And so these are some of the reasons why England didn't really colonize, because of the conflict between Spain and England, and the fact that Spain had more naval dominance than England at the time, and so the unfriendly relationship didn't allow England to colonize at all before that. So the first attempt at colonization was in 1585, and it was an expedition that landed on North Carolina's Roanoke Islands, so it's called the Roanoke Colony, and it was led by Sir Walter Raleigh. And it was the first attempt at colonization in the Americas, but it was a failure because the colony was eventually lost, and thus known as the Lost Colony. No one really knows whatever happened to it. And so, basically, the first colonization attempt was a failure in the Americas, and that's what's important to remember here. And now, for England's rise, this is the turn of where England begins to colonize, and that happens when Spain attacks Britain in 1588. Spain brought their armada to attack Britain, and the Spanish Armada was actually defeated. And this ensured British naval dominance over the Spanish, because previously the Spanish had controlled the North Atlantic and prevented England from colonizing, but now the British had more naval dominance in the North Atlantic, and so they could go and colonize as they pleased. The defeat of the Spanish Armada also spawned a strong sense of nationalism in England, and promoted more religious and governmental unity. And all this squabbles between England and Spain were eventually settled in 1604 when they signed the peace treaty. Now, these are some of the things to remember for why England began to colonize and what sort of drove them. So with the North Atlantic open, Britain's population began to explode and mushroom. They began to have problems with land, as with the new policy of enclosure, where land was fenced off for farming, but this meant that no land was left for the poor or the people who without a job. They couldn't get land, and so they sort of had a drive to go out and make their own fortune and find their own land. And that also has to do with primogeniture, which was the decree that the firstborn son inherited all of the father's land. And so they had other siblings besides the firstborn had incentive to go out and make their own fortune because they would not inherit their own. And finally, during the beginning of the 1600s, the joint stock company was perfected. And a joint stock company was where investors pooled their money into a company, and they would fund an expedition or something that would give them a good return. And so it would be the forerunner of today's corporations. And what this allowed was funding of expeditions to the Americas and to the New World, in hopes of gold and other riches coming back. So we'll begin with the first colony, which was Virginia, and the first settlement, which was Jamestown. Now, Jamestown was created after a Virginia stock company, a joint stock company, was given a charter by King James I to settle the New World in 1606. And the joint stock companies didn't really exist long, as they tried to turn a profit, and so they would try and make money and then go away. But these joint stock companies that began investing and going out to the colonies began to last longer. And what they got from this charter was the charter guaranteed the settlers the same rights as Englishmen, and so that was a very important fact. And so in 1607, Jamestown was founded by 100 English settlers. Now, all these settlers were men primarily because they were looking for gold and trying to get riches, and so that was one of the problems, was that they were all primarily men. And then some problems that they faced was the site where they settled at Jamestown. It was swampy. The people there were no women. And so there was also greed over survival. So people began to look for gold, and they didn't focus on setting up and making a sustainable settlement. So they began to starve and die. And this happened until John Smith took charge in 1608, and he sort of whipped the settlers into shape. He had a policy of, if you don't work, you don't eat. And he was kidnapped by the Native Americans and forced into a mock execution. And the reason for this was the chief's daughter was meant to stop the execution before it actually happened, to show that the Native Americans didn't mean any harm. And that daughter was actually Pocahontas. And then in 1610, a relief party arrived to Jamestown and alleviated the suffering that was going on there, because before, colonists were eating dogs, rats, and cats, and any other, even dead people. And so in 1610, when the relief party arrived, it was basically the beginning of actually stably living in the Americas, and it was led by Lord Delaware. And so, a fact that's important to know is that by 1625, only 1,200 settlers of the original 8,000 that had tried settling there had survived. And this is trying to show that it was a really rough existence in the American frontier when they were first landing. Now, the cultural clash in the Chesapeake is important. So this is about the conflicts that the settlers and the Native Americans had. So the Powhatan considered the new colonists potential allies. These were the Native Americans that were around Jamestown, and the colonists really were friendly at first, but then they began to raid Indian food supplies, and this eventually led to war. And that led to the First Anglo-Powhatan War in 1610 to 1614, and it ended with the marriage of Pocahontas to the colonist John Rolfe, who we'll get to later. And then in 1622, the Indians struck again with a series of attacks that left 347 settlers dead, including John Rolfe, who was an important figure. And then the Second Anglo-Powhatan War went from 1644 to 1646, and it removed the Chesapeake Indians from their ancestral lands, and we see that the European settlers began coming in and kicking the Native Americans out of their lands. And so it's important to realize that the settlers were friendly towards the Native Americans until they began to produce their own food, and they didn't really serve a purpose, because the European settlers really had a greed for land, and they began to kick the Native Americans off their land, whether peacefully or not. And so we'll start off with the first colony here. This is where the chapter sort of gets to a point where they begin to talk about the different colonies. And so the first one is Virginia, which is the child of tobacco. So Jamestown was in Virginia, and it found its wealth in tobacco, because if you remember, they were being funded by these joint stock companies which wanted money out of it. So they were really able to find their gold, so to speak, in tobacco. And that's after John Rolfe, who I mentioned earlier, who was the husband of Pocahontas, had perfected a method of growing and curing tobacco. And it thrived in the Americas, and it was sweet tobacco that was very, very desired in Europe. And so tobacco was grown in the Americas and shipped back to Europe for a huge profit. The only problem was tobacco was depleting the soil, and so it drove America's desire for more and more land in the South. And so in 1619, the settlers created the House of Burgesses, which was a committee to work out local issues in Virginia. And this is important to remember, um, because it's the first sort you see of a democracy in America, even though it was very rudimentary, and like it didn't wasn't entirely close, but it was the first step towards it. And the first African Americans were arrived to Virginia, which is important to remember, in 1619, but we don't know if they were slaves or indentured servants at the time. Now, I'm going to explain more in the next video, but for now I'm going to stop the video here, and we'll pick up in the next one.